I want to talk a little bit about this idea from Lucy Suchman. And this is an idea I come back to a fair amount in my work, but this question of who is doing what to whom here, and I think it's an important question, actually resonates deeply with the speakers with Sarah and Lucy so far. So how and with whom we set a given design problem creates the conditions and possibilities through which we can approach it as designers, and I think everybody has already kind of spoken to that today. So as Donald Shun famously argued, designers do what he calls setting the things by which a problem is defined. And I want to try to problematize that a little bit today. So to this end, designers are always asking questions. They're asking, how do we build a better shopping cart in one famous example? How do we build an impenetrable, unscalable wall in one very close to home example? How do we reimagine the affective conditions of security and insecurity in this example that came wrapped around my newspaper one weekend morning? So when we make the questions we follow into a design process or out of process and into form, we are also making arguments for how things might be, how they should be, how they have been. And critically, we're articulating relationships between these. And I don't think I'm saying anything new here. I'm just sort of trying to bring it into a specific context. So in considering the question, how should designers intervene in the public sphere, I kept running into two thoughts as I was imagining what I could talk about today. And one was always as listeners, mostly as listeners, sometimes only as listeners. And the second was always and forever not alone, never alone. So what I mean by that is that design happens in context. It is always political, it is social, it is always ideological, even when what we think we're doing is operating under a sort of broader idea of the public good. And it is, in this sense, always specific. So in public, what is held to be common sense, and I want to reflect on that a little bit today, should not be confused with what is considered common or shared or in the public good. So I work primarily with people and organizations who are working to end the systems of policing, incarceration, surveillance, and control, which often together are referred to as the prison industrial complex. And I'll say, in relation to some of the work we've seen already today, I think increasingly that also includes a strong critique of borders, which we've even seen sort of in the US become an abolish ICE movement, and ICE is the Border Patrol's new name, post 9/11. So in this specific context that I work in, what is common sense, as anthropologist Melissa Birch has argued, is typically constructed from accumulations of power that are codified into law. But in general terms, the common sense with which designers in this context work presumes that crime is and conditions of policing or incarceration is a problem, and that improving police and prisons and their functions are a solution. The root of this has led not only to a massive system of imprisonment over the last several decades, and not just in the US, but especially in the US, but to the shift of resources and work that might be considered care-focused into police and military budgets and purviews. And I think we heard some interesting stuff about this shift also into libraries this morning that I would love to talk about somehow. So Birch reminds us that when people say crime, they rarely mean unlawful act, much less action which happens to have been labeled unlawful in this particular place at this particular time according to the prevailing social, political, and economic order. But of course, that is what things that are called crime are, right? They're legal artifacts. So this historically grounded unsettling of the notion of crime necessarily affects both the work of and the potential for designing in this arena. It raises other critical questions. Whose safety is at issue? How is it defined? And how is it compromised? This pattern and practice of what scholar and organizer Mariam Kaba calls mass criminalization impacts people of color, queer folks, migrants and immigrants, women and poor people overwhelmingly, while, and this part is important, also implicating and having structural effects on most everyone, because this has become a fundamental means through which power and access to resources and the imagination of futures are organized, right? So prisons don't only affect people inside them, although that effect is deeply, deeply important and should always be centralized. They affect all of us who are not inside them for the things that we get from that. So I want to give two fast, necessarily very incomplete anecdotes to think about the responsibilities and possibilities of designers acting in public in this context. So this quote is taken from the retirement speech of William Bratton, a longtime police chief and commissioner in both New York City and Los Angeles. Bratton is most well known for implementing the aggressive quality of life policing style in both cities that included what some of you may know of as stop and frisk. which accounted for the stops of millions of people a year in both cities, mostly folks of color and often young people. So New York City has one of the largest police forces in the world, if you didn't know, and one of the largest jails. It's called Rikers Island. This jail houses thousands of people a day and brings thousands of more through as visitors to loved ones, as people going to various kinds of service jobs. But until very recently, was not even on the public transit map that is in all of the trains across the city. The centrality of policing to the imagination of public life is encapsulated in Bratton's easy insistence in this quote, that the work of policing is never done. But New York City is currently undergoing political struggle over broad-based calls taken on by local officials to close Rikers Island. The Close Rikers campaign, once adopted by government, but not only government, gave rise, however, to a $10 billion plan for smaller jails in 4 of the 5 boroughs of New York City. To make these jails, the city brought together a group of people that included design experts and criminal justice experts, so-called, to create a series of stories and the accompanying visuals about what they would end up proposing were these structures called justice hubs. And these now are the subject of fierce opposition themselves. Community organizing that brings together anti-prison organizations, prisoners, former prisoners, and neighborhood advocates to fight both to close Rikers and to stop this new jail construction from happening. If the Design Commission is seeking to create a more humane jail system as a public service, which is sort of the language of its proposition, the No New Jails NYC Coalition is arguing not only that there is no such thing as a humane jail, but that the jails themselves are a racist, sexist misappropriation of power and resources. Fundamentally different constructions. In Oakland, California, and this is my other short story where most of my work is located, Organizers with Critical Resistance, which is an organization working to abolish the prison industrial complex, emerged from a long campaign to end the use of gang injunctions, which itself is an incredibly complex legal structure that's used to target people in particular neighborhoods, mostly for isolation and sort of random arrest. With the idea that they could shift the story police and city officials were telling about Oakland and what Oakland residents need. They kept encountering a story that Oakland was violent, it was terrible, it lacked resources, but what they knew from their own lives and from the lived lives of allies was in fact that Oakland was not only fairly represented this way, that it was a place of lush life for lots of people who made their long lives and whose people had made their lives there for a long time. So after years of city council refusals to shift spending and resources from policing to other supportive and community-led services, CR organizers determined to build a project that would learn from, amplify, and build the power and capacity of people to articulate and meet their own needs in ways that could reduce police presence and intervention. And so they imagined shifting the story that was available of the city from one that was dominated by the police, who just for context take about 50% of the city budget even now, and one that actually allowed other voices to speak more loudly and perhaps take up more space. So the questions that led this process led us to identify a first project that led us to identify a first project that was the decoupling of medical and mental health care from policing, which it turned out was a massive problem in the city, as experienced by people who called the 911 to get an ambulance, for instance, when someone was in mental or physical distress, and the first thing to arrive was a police car, right? Because they are circulating in ways that ambulances are not, especially in certain neighborhoods. And so by asking these questions, we were able to figure out that there was this desire to both learn how to de-escalate situations, how to have resources that did not involve calling 911, being able to still get medical professionals on site, and also skilling up so that people would deliver immediate care themselves. So this participatory sort of coalition building process led to creating these kinds of basic tools to do the work. And these workshops that got developed through this process have now been done with over 50 groups, organizations, and sort of loose coalitions of people seeking alternatives to calling the police, and allowed them to begin building with people both locally and nationally. So just in conclusion, the perspective and position or the framing of the question, what do we want? Shape the questions we ask and the possibilities we can imagine as designers and also as people in the world. So what does it mean, and what would it take to shift from imagining designers as problem setters, as many of us have talked about today, to value a more collective process of problem posing, especially where that entails a claim on who gets to tell the stories that lead design in inevitably contested publics. And I borrow this term, problem posing, from Paulo Freire, who proposed this as a dialectical educational process rooted in liberation, importantly, or as an approach to making visible the structures that right now we as designers are so often engaged in reforming or refining or improving, and instead focusing on ways that they might be undone. To this end, I would argue that designers have to be willing to let what falls outside the brief, especially in public, negate the brief. If the thing cannot be made, we need to make the space to not make it. The space to say, no, we will not make this because what we are hearing, because we entered listening and not alone, is that this thing, this system, this service cannot or should not be made. Here, instead, are some of the things that could be, that people have been making, that people are already making now, making anyway, even in the face of this complexity. Thanks.